Good morning, everyone. I am Stuart Shanker, and I'd like to welcome you to the first episode of our Shanker Chronicles podcast. This is a 6 episode podcast series, which gives me an opportunity to take a deep dive into the historical, scientific, political, and philosophical background of some of the most important issues of our day. So, thank you all for joining me as we work towards a more regulated society, a self-reg society, a truly just society. I thought that for today, for our very first podcast, I would look at the issue that really everyone is talking about constantly, and that's how polarized our society is becoming. Not just our society, but it looks like every society around the world is becoming increasingly polarized. And, there's nothing particularly new about saying that we've become deeply polarized. But it does raise for self-reggers some very interesting questions. As I started to think about this, I couldn't help but go back to my early days at Oxford when I was an undergraduate. And I realized that I was really being trained in political theory to be a liberal democratic thinker. So they started us off reading John Milton's Areopagitica, and then we went from there. We read John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. We finished up with Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty. So it was drilled into us from the very start that our society, modern Western society, was based on this idea of a social contract. The idea that there would always be fierce political debate around, the leading issues of the time, but that every individual recognized that it was in their best interests to have a society governed by consensus, whatever it might be. You would accept the majority decision because of the returns, namely that you lived in a safe and relatively harmonious society. And if you think about it, right from the start, I wondered if this wasn't some sort of naive rationalist vision of how societies operate. And I say that because every Friday night, I had a seminar that I'd go to from 5 until 7. And we sat around a huge table and discussed various issues about the nature of language, the nature of thought. And Oxford at that time, at the graduate level, was very polarized. So here we had, some of the world's leading logicians, and they divided into two camps, the Phrygians and the Wittgensteinians. And what was weird was that the two camps sat on opposite sides of the table. And it quickly became apparent to me that nobody was really listening to what the other side was saying, that in no sense were they trying to work together to resolve some, deep philosophical problem. Instead, what it was all about was trying to, one up the opposite side, find some element in their argument that you could attack. And it got pretty heated to the point where the two sides wouldn't even talk to each other if they saw each other on the street. These were two warring camps, and this is weird because in my daytime lectures I was learning all about the importance of consensus, but here I was watching the leading magicians of my time, and they were anything but interested in consensus. So it was already clear to me that something else is going on in polarization, that it's not simply a case of you have two contrary sides and they don't agree on some basic idea or principle. Um, there was some deep emotional issue that was subverting this so-called rational process. And so I couldn't help but wonder, what hope was there for society at large if not even a relatively privileged group of logicians could discuss things with a single goal, the goal of, resolving some problem or finding truth, whatever, however you defined it. So I was discouraged. I began to feel that the original liberal democratic idea of consensus politics was just that, just an ideal. I wasn't sure that you'd ever really achieve it. But something different is happening today. So it's not enough to just say, well, we're very polarized, and that makes political agreement very difficult, if even feasible. There's something else that's going on here. And it's not simply that we've become polarized, that all kinds of things happen when an individual, a citizen or whoever is polarized, um, that that rational discourse becomes hard. What's different today is um, political parties for about the last 25 years now have gone out of their way to cultivate polarization. In other words, if we were to say, if we had this opportunity to meet with our political leaders and say, "Don't you see how polarized we've become?" Their response would be, "Thank you, I've done a good job." In other words, they are deliberately seeking to cultivate polarization. Now, that's always been true, I think, of democratic politics. As far back as you can go, we can see rabble rousing. We can see would-be demagogues. I mean, this is nothing new, but there is an element that's new today, and that is how they're doing it, are how they are cultivating polarization. The reason why they're cultivating polarization is fairly clear. What happens when someone is polarized is, well, to begin with, you're polarized. Essentially, you become polarized around negative emotions, principally anger and fear. And so the human being, we tend to band together in the face of anger and fear. There's the security of the group. This is wired into the limbic system at a very early age. So to say that that we see tribalism, at a fairly pitched level today is for the political leaders or the political machinery a sign that they have been doing their job well. That's what they want. And you'll cultivate the tribalism any way you can, maybe with a T-shirt that everyone wears that denigrates the opposite side, or you put signs on your front lawn, or so all of this is, an indication that whatever you're doing, um, as a party that's trying to provoke polarization, you're doing your job well. Now, when we become polarized, this for self-reg is essentially, it means that we've gone red brain. And that right away tells us that your ability to process, whether it's what your own side is saying or what the other side is saying, is very sharply constricted. There's a very interesting report just the other day about a voter in Virginia, and he was rabidly Republican because the other side believed in critical race theory. And the news reporter began questioning him. What was it about critical race theory that he disliked? And at the end of the interview, it was clear that he didn't know anything. He didn't know what it was. But that's the point, it was what used to be called a shibboleth. It's just it was a way of all of this group banding together. That's what's significant here, and you're not really processing the whys. Your ability to think carefully is exactly what they are, what the polarizer is seeking to constrain. So we go into red brain. We can't really process what the other side is saying or feeling. And one of the things that happens in red brain is that your emotions become all or nothing. Meaning that if you look, say, at a child that's gone red brain and they're angry with their parent, all they feel is the anger and the fact that they might also love their parent. It just disappears because you can't have these conflicting emotions. You just have the sort of very primitive emotional reaction. So we find that as a fundamental aspect of polarization, empathy for the other side really does disappear or is significantly reduced. And then we've got, a very important part of logic is what's called reality-based thinking. And this is, if you follow the work that Stanley Greenspan did, or in our book, The First Idea, we make the case that reality-based thinking is fundamentally bound up with emotions, with emotion regulation. And so when you're in red brain and you're in effect regressing to a lower emotion level of emotional functioning, your ability to distinguish between reality and non-reality fantasy is sharply constrained. So that makes you vulnerable to, say, something like outrageous conspiracy theories, because it's now becoming very difficult in this red brain state to distinguish between, what, say, a public health official is saying and what some anonymous so-called expert is saying on social media. So all of these are, if what you're after is to create this polarized voting bloc, these are good. This is what you want. This is how, there are a couple of positive outcomes for the political party that is seeking to cultivate this. One is that it's a way of trying to get back into power or stay in power, or at the very least, you are subverting the ability of the government in power to manage effectively. And so it all becomes, politics is no longer um, a function of what I was taught as an undergrad, trying to solve together very difficult, if not intractable problems. Instead, what you're doing is, politics has become a zero-sum game, and it's really just about using polarization to get into power, stay in power. Okay, so far, all I'm saying is, this is relatively familiar to everyone that's following the news today. Um, so, where does self-reg enter into this? Now, with self-reg, what we're trying to do is, if we are deeply overstressed, we really want to understand before we can begin to reduce our stress, before we can get to that state of calmness, which is the precursor of restoration. We really need to understand why we're overstressed. What is the cause of my being essentially in this chronic state of being overstressed? And that's where we see something very significant happening today. Okay. And I wanted to read you a quotation. This came out last week, I believe. Now, are there's two ways you can basically um, get a group to band together. There's two ways you can, inspire this sense of unity. I think back to when I was a teenager and Pierre Elliott Trudeau made his incredible march where he mobilized the country around this concept of a just society. So we can see how strong pro-social emotions can bring a group together. And that's very inspiring when it happens. And we saw Obama do this in his first run. We saw JFK do this, Nelson Mandela, all kinds of examples of how strong pro-social emotions can create this sense of shared belief, a shared harmony in a group of electors. But we are seeing something different today. And we've been seeing it, as I said, for about 25 years, but now it's getting very intense. So here's a quotation I wanted to read you. It came out in a different set of chronicles. It came out in the Facebook chronicles that were published in the Wall Street Journal. And this quotation really, really caught me. Quote, Facebook's ranking algorithm treated emoji reactions as 5 times more valuable than likes, internal documents reveal. The theory was simple. Posts that prompted lots of reaction emoji, that in other words, anger, tended to keep users more engaged. And keeping users engaged was the key to Facebook's business. Okay, so just to put that in perspective, what they're saying there is that what Facebook discovered was that an entry that made users angry, that triggered anger, was 5 times more effective for their business model than having a like, saying, I like this post. And so that's what's going on today. And if you think about, say, all those Twitter comments, which were, so upsetting, they were designed to trigger anger. And whether you were against what the Twitter post said or you were in agreement, it was a win-win for the team that was sending out these posts, because what they were triggering was polarization around anger. Anger, it turns out, is incredibly effective at all of the things I mentioned above about polarization, getting a group to band together, promoting tribalism. And what they've discovered is that if you can get a group of individuals angry enough, they will obstruct the opposite party from doing anything, and then dramatically increase their chances of winning in the next cycle. And if you live in a society where the cycle is every 2 years, then what's happening? There's one election or another every 2 years. Then what's happening is you are exposed to this constant wave of feeling very angry, of with all of the consequences of this red brain state that I mentioned. There's something very troubling about this as a political strategy. In many ways, it distorts the political reality. So this is not about how we actually govern. It's about how we win power. And there's an article in CNN on Tuesday that really caught my attention. And the headline was this: Tuesday's elections in Virginia and New Jersey showed that the U.S. is a more moderate and centrist country than activists on either the right or the left let on. And so it then, in the body of the article, and this is something that's familiar to us in Canada, that the distance in terms of legislation between conservative and liberal is it's more a matter of degree than of this sharp swing on the political spectrum. So here we have what I think is this dramatic sort of distinction between the rhetoric, which is designed to polarize, and the actual governing, which is designed not to polarize. But the problem is that the electorate, the individual, is paying a very heavy price for this. Because if you are, and the price is not simply that you become hostile to your neighbor, that you become sort of the essence of tribalism is that you become blind, deaf, I should say, to what the other side is saying, incapable of hearing them, not interested in listening to them, only interested in your side winning. We actually pay a very heavy price for that. We pay a heavy price for being stuck in red brain. And the price is, you become chronically anxious. And I think that that's what we're seeing around the world today, these heightened levels of anxiety. And it's playing out at every level. It's playing out, we are certainly seeing an explosion of anxiety related disorders in children and teens. Amongst adults, what we're seeing are, these sudden eruptions of not just anger, but of rage, which over the most trivial of things, and our inability to, in a meaningful way, reach consensus. I mean, it's become very difficult to believe at all in the original liberal democratic vision of democracy. But we pay an even deeper price. And the deeper price is that anger and fear, but anger is very, very expensive. We are expending enormous amounts of energy. And it's not just, it's not just in these confrontations with individuals that belong to the other tribe. You are burning energy just reading a newspaper article, just reading a tweet. That sudden burst of adrenaline or epinephrine, it's expensive. And so what we're seeing today is really a society that is stuck in the bottom right of the Thayer matrix, meaning a society where we are all in a low energy, high tension state. So, how do we begin to correct this? And that's the whole point of these podcasts. It's really to recognize what's going on, to come to terms with that we are overstressed, and then figuring out why am I overstressed. And there's all kinds of stresses that are going on in the world today, and the stresses are financial, the obvious stress of the pandemic. But on top of all that, we are gripped in a political cycle that is that doesn't give us any respite, doesn't give us that chance of restoring, of feeling that the last big polarized fight is over and now we get a break. Now we get to just relax a bit and do what Milton preached, and that is, begin to work on the problems that really do matter, such as the degradation of the environment. So we have a duty, not just an opportunity, but a duty as self-reggers to help everyone understand that this is happening, why this is happening, and we don't want this to happen anymore. We need now to distance ourselves from all those attempts to trigger anger in us or fear. In fact, the two become what's called undifferentiated. The anger is bound up with the fear of whatever the theme is, the fear of foreigners, the fear of whatever, or quite simply the fear of the other side. This is one of the most potent motivators, if you like, polarizers. Um, so we need to see that this is happening, and then we need others to see that they are overstressed, that they are in red brain, and that what's required when we're in red brain is to turn off the alarm. So what's required is soothing. And that's what Milton and that's what Mill and that's what Berlin didn't quite realize. That what we've learned from the science of the last 30 years, what we've learned is the effect of having a kindled limbic alarm. So now what we have to do is we have to turn off that alarm in ourselves and help before we enter any kind of political dialogue. We have to help others turn off the alarm, get back into that state where the liberal democratic dream becomes viable. So that's kind of what I see myself as doing in these podcasts. Not just describing, not just repeating a term, but trying to go a little deeper, trying to figure out the why. And in Self-Reg, that's what we always do. We're always asking why and why now. So I hope you found this interesting. This podcast was brought to us today by Self-Reg Global, and this is part of our mission to bring Self-Reg knowledge to audiences around the world. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope you'll subscribe and follow us on social media. And if you missed anything, you can check out the show notes, which are at Self-Reg Global's website, selfregglobal.com. Thank you very much for joining me today on this first episode of the Shanker Chronicles, and join me again next week as I will look at another global issue that has been on everyone's mind. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next week.